Hello from the Clio Cloud Conference online everywhere in the world. I'm Laurence Colletti.
I'm George Psiharis.
And we're on the road with Legal Talk Network. And we're back. Thank you so much for joining us on the road, virtually speaking anyway. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's our first conference since, must be back in March when we did ABA Tech Show. But I have a great guest, one of my favorites, of course, George Psiharis joined us from Clio. Welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Laurence.
Absolutely. This is becoming a regular thing. I'm glad we were able to maintain this tradition, talking about the Clio Legal Trends Report. Obviously, I'm biased here. It's one of my favorites of the year that comes out, and I think just such insightful information. But, you're the Chief Operating Officer now. Is that a recent promotion, I think?
It's sort of recent. By my tenure at Clio, recent, but it's been a couple of years. So about halfway through 2018, I switched from a pretty similar sounding job, which was VP of Business Operations, to Chief Operating Officer. Thanks for noticing me.
Yeah, well, no, it took me a while to notice. This is why I don't get invited to a lot of parties, George. But anyway, I know this year's been a little bit different. I definitely want to get into that. But, how long have you been at Clio? Has it actually been 10 years?
It has. Actually, just in August here, I celebrated my 10-year, what we call Clioversary.
Wow, that's a long time. So when you started off, what was your position when you started off?
It was a great story. When I first started at Clio, I didn't actually really have a position. I just had a specialty. So I was called Customer Development, a brainchild of a conversation between Jack Ryan and myself, Jack and Ryan being the two co-founders of the company. And eventually that turned into a real job, which was a manager of our strategic partnerships and a director of business development shortly after that. So really focused on when we first entered the market, working with partners, law schools, bar associations, et cetera.
Awesome. Well, let's get to it. Let's talk about the Legal Trends Report. I know this year has been different. There's been sort of tricklings out, these impact briefings, of course, related to COVID-19, and a lot of that transition into this year's report. But there's some other stuff too I want to get into. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's learn what's new to this report and then how those impact briefings got in there.
Yep. So you mentioned earlier that as the realities of the COVID pandemic hit, we decided to change up our approach in a really important way. So instead of doing our usual move, which is releasing a whole raft of insights together on an annual basis, we plan to do that and to start publishing more insights in real time. And those showed up as these recurring impact of COVID briefings we did, where we wanted to track how significant and noticeable the shock was on an economic side to the legal profession. We saw very quick, reactions to a lot of the economic shutdowns that we saw, where we saw matter intake volumes across the board, and also billings really take a steep decline, especially through the earlier periods in April and March, April, and May, I should say, and sustaining a bit of a rebound, but still not returning to previous levels through the summer and into later this year. So we started off with those, and then as we started to get our initial observations, really dove into a few areas that we published as part of the Legal Trends Report this year.
Okay. Were there any standouts? I know that I've been watching the trends, and so there was definitely this dip in March, April, really pretty sharp decline, and then it's sort of been gradually coming back up, but it seems to be a little flat this last quarter, which, obviously to some is a little bit alarming, but, was it, obviously I don't think it was the same across the boards. Some specialties in law were doing better than others. So any insights there?
Yeah, so a couple things we noticed early on. Obviously, the places that were hardest hit by the pandemic had even more significant decreases in business and in revenue resulting from that business. So New York being a great example that we were able to publish. We also saw transactional practice areas get hit the hardest. So perhaps unsurprisingly, things like traffic offenses, criminal defense, personal injury, not only did they kind of go through that, trough that we saw in terms of demand, that steep decline, they felt it more strongly as they slowed down more than most. So for traffic offenses, for instance, we saw in some of these periods as much as a 70% decline in matter intake versus previous levels. So pretty big, impact. And going with the theme of 2020 kind of fits into the tough news category, right? Things were not pretty out there as folks felt the knock-on effects of was arguably one of the most unique economic scenarios we've ever experienced. At the same time, though, something that stood out from this year's report was that some firms started to really pull ahead of others in the way that they performed. Where we saw that was in firms that deployed these three kind of cloud-based, but also client-facing technologies. And those were online payments, legal intake and CRM, and client portals, so online interfaces where people were sharing stuff with their clients. And of course, all things that became more useful than ever in shelter in place or work from home and virtual working environments. So really interesting to see that. And altogether, firms that implemented all three of those solutions in August of this year collected 40% more revenue per lawyer than those that had none of those solutions implemented.
That's pretty impressive, and just kind of watching some of the other stats on your report, that definitely stands out. People that were able to get in front of that early. I think the earlier you got in front of that, the better off you were. I want to transition to some of the layoffs and furloughs, and so I know that there's been some confidence issues. I think with the business aspect of the legal profession, and so how are we looking on layoffs and furloughs right now?
Yeah, it's looking like we saw a pretty steep series of layoffs and furloughs early on in the pandemic as well. And it's very similarly mapped, as far as I can tell, to the revenue total. So as businesses bounce back a bit and stayed kind of flat, I think we're seeing the same pattern emerge with the confidence level the different firms have, and with the staffing that they choose to, how and when they choose to bring folks back from furloughs. I think there are some questions though remaining as we get deeper into the pandemic and, perhaps what some people would think of as a second wave. We could see, I think, another round of adjustments made in firms that are really working hard to make ends meet, but might not be able to keep everybody on board or bring them back as they planned. So I'd say, we're seeing somewhat of a bounce back and then a flattening through the course of this previous quarter, but I don't think we're fully out of the weeds here yet.
Yeah, one more thing that was discouraging to me was just the confidence that attorneys are putting into their own practices. And so maybe some comments to that effect as well.
Yeah, I mean, throughout, one of the things we did in this study was what we call a longitudinal analysis. So we're asking people kind of the same stuff over a projected period of time and seeing if that changes. And something that hasn't changed much is this confidence level. So we have the majority of law firms more concerned about their firm's ability to make ends meet and to perform economically than they are even about their own financial or economic well-being as individuals. And yeah, like you said, they're not feeling a ton of confidence yet in being able to totally walk back some of the staffing changes that they made previously in the year.
We recently did a show on the number of bankruptcy filings, which at initial blush, I was surprised how low they were. But then after we had a guest on, she was talking about some of the reasons why it's delayed. There's moratoriums that are still out there, and not all of the corrections have hit. And so getting to that, we had your boss on, Jack Newton, of course, CEO and founder of Clio, on our March 20th Legal Talk Today show. And one of the things that we talked about was this pent up demand that might still be in some of the need for legal services that have not manifested themselves yet. People are sort of holding back on financials right now. They don't want to get into a legal issue, even though they may really need that help. And so as George looks at me right now, if you're not in the video, and you can't really see because I've covered it up very nicely, I need a haircut super bad. So I probably am about 3 or 4 haircuts overdue. And if I take these headphones off, it'll be a disaster. But that's lost demand. So if I get one haircut tomorrow, the market lost 3 of those haircuts. Whereas my tires on my Camry, my Toyota Camry, I'm sort of delaying getting those tires, but I will get those tires, so that demand's not lost. And so that's that pent up demand as opposed to the lost demand. And so, George, just in terms of that, with what you all are seeing, how much of the demand on legal services do you think is pent up?
Yeah, it's a great observation, Laurence, and something that came through loud and clear in the analysis. So, a 2018 study by the Federal Reserve on economic well-being in the U.S. found that 39% of Americans reported that they couldn't afford to pay for an unexpected or emergency $400 expense. That's about an hour and a half of the typical lawyer's hourly billable rate. And I think we can all agree that that situation has not gotten any better in 2020 than it was in previous years. And so I think what a lot of people are seeing is, to your point, deferral versus a loss of demand. The legal problems and the advice folks need isn't necessarily going away. Their ability to pay for it or to think that they can pay for it is getting in the way of them jumping into the market and looking for a lawyer to help them. And so it's kind of having 2 impacts on the market. We see 61% of consumers reporting that they don't believe they could afford a legal issue at all. So that's a majority of consumers saying, even if I had a legal problem and I knew that I had a legal problem, I still don't think I'd be able to afford it. We even saw 33% of consumers report that they thought law firms had shut their doors altogether and weren't offering services because they assumed things like court closures were preventing legal services from being delivered, when only, in fact, 2% of the law firms we surveyed reported having at any point closed business. So there's this kind of perception of what's going on out there and perception of ability to pay that's leading to a lot of individuals deferring their legal problems. Now, that hurts big time in the short term, and it definitely maps to that huge drop we saw over the course of 2020 in legal demand. But it also means that this demand is out there waiting for us, right? And there is this, as we refer to it, tsunami of demand waiting out there. The question is, how are we going to go tackle that demand? And one of the interesting areas we spent some time in the Legal Trends Report is in identifying that we're not really going back to normal in some ways the way we did before.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you're 100% right on that. I definitely want to follow up on that question, but quick follow up on consumers not knowing that lawyers are open. I mean, in this world where we're buying everything on Amazon and things are coming to our front doorsteps like never before, how is it possible that consumers don't know that lawyers' offices are open virtually?
It's a great question. I think that the number one starting point is that I always reflect back on this statement of state your obvious. And I think of a practitioner I met over the years, and back when we were traveling to conferences and meeting in person, who shared with me
the good old days.
The good old days of reminding their team members something called FTFT, which stands for first time for them. So I think, when you get super experienced and into things as a lawyer, someone providing legal advice, you get used to it, right? And things that are obvious seem obvious to you. Things that are obvious to you but not obvious to your clients might surprise you. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here, where they don't know, like they're assuming, and it's holding them back both from affordability but also from being open. And I think that the top thing we can do there is communicate, right? Make sure you're getting out there and letting people know. I've seen a few law firms add "we're open" to the top of their web pages and make sure that people know that they're open for services. And those are the simple starting points.
Well, let's build on that, because I do know that part of this year's report was really talking about what consumers were looking for when they're hiring. And so let's say that the consumer's like, all right, listen, I can't wait any longer. I want to save money, but I really need to get some legal help here. And let's say they're like, I found a lawyer who's open. What are the things that, especially now with the COVID-19 new normal, what do consumers care about versus what do they not care about right now?
Yeah, it's super fascinating stuff this year. And quite frankly, Laurence, different than what we've seen in previous years. Things are changing in some very interesting ways. So first, a big part of our analysis is always unpacking where lawyer and client expectations and things that matter to them are actually quite different. So we traditionally see this chasm between what lawyers are caring about and what's top of the list for clients in terms of their priorities. This year, a very, very different story. So the top ranking consideration, we asked law firms about what success looks like and what factors drive their success. We ask similar questions of clients and ask what makes a lawyer most hireable. And for the first time in our 5 years doing the Legal Trends Report, or all of my 10 years at Clio, we saw almost identical sets of preferences from both groups. At the top of the list was referrals and reviews. Lawyers are looking to get those referrals and reviews. Clients are now more than ever looking to consult those reviews and referrals from close personal connections. At the absolute bottom of the list was office space. No one seemed to care, I think for obvious reason, how nice someone's physical office space was. It was not a hireability factor for clients. We're not going to pick you based on how cool your lobby is or how much cool artwork you have up in there. And at the same time, it didn't seem to matter much at all for lawyers either. And in between was this really interesting trend around accelerated technology adoption among clients. We've got stories in this year's Legal Trends Report of 90-year-olds signing engagement letters via iPads.
Wow.
Yeah. It's happening out there. And at the same time, law firms and lawyers adopting technology both to serve their clients better and to make their lives easier as they adapt to building a better normal out there. And so the preferences are converging for one of the first times that I can remember. I think what was interesting as well, though, in some of the analysis was clients don't know that yet. So going back to that whole point around, I don't know if they're open, or I don't think I could afford it, or that a flexible option exists for me to afford legal services at this time. We also saw clients expecting less of lawyers than they were actually doing, where over 80% of lawyers reported that they were using the cloud to engage with their clients and meeting clients virtually. But a minority of clients expected that was the case prior to reaching out and seeing that that's what lawyers were doing. So lots of interesting opportunities out there where it's not all bad news, right? And a big theme for us in the Legal Trends Report is to try to connect people with the insights that show them how to get it done and how to succeed out there.
Well, I just have a couple more questions for you. And so one of these, a real matter of curiosity for me. And so, over time, I've noticed that the cost of tuition at graduate school institutions, including law school, has gone up. And oftentimes it's outstripped the consumer price index. And so I think for the first time on the Clio Legal Trends Report, we see the billable hour listed up against the consumer price index. And then there's also a comparison against non-legal services that are provided out there, like maybe an accountant or someone of that nature. And so what was interesting, George, you all mapped that out from the last recession. And so the last recession, everybody's rates were down. Everybody was below kind of the increase of the consumer price index. But the billable hour has outstripped the climb past the consumer price index, whereas other services are either behind the consumer price index or just barely keeping up with it. And so, what attributes that? Because it seems like, things that we're buying today, we're getting cheaper, maybe not during COVID, but, in recent years, we're getting services for less expense. There's a lot of savings passed on to consumers. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Plus one to your point around the cost of getting into the profession increasing. So most folks, whether they're able to find a job at a school or hang their own shingle, are still faced with, let's be honest, crippling amounts of debt often, and they need to find a way to get there. And I think that raising prices a little bit faster than CPI or consumer price indexes is one of those ways where you feel like you might be getting ahead. The challenge is that in the long run, I don't think that you do, right? You start to price yourself out of the market and start to widen this gap between what could be a lot more volume business out there. And of course, it varies by practice area, it varies by location and prices in those areas. But there's this short-term, win, but probably long-term pain that comes with only focusing on raising rates faster than the other things that people are paying for. And I think one of the places that applies pressure is on using technology to streamline the way that you operate. It's not about, shortcutting the quality of the legal advice or the representation that you're providing folks. It's more about eliminating that other overhead cost. And I think what we see in other professions is a little bit more adoption of technology that streamlines once it is that you've mapped out what client experience you want to have, how you want your firm to operate, then going and deploying different types of technology to get there. And the other being offering a bit of flexibility to clients. So I think we've seen more other forms of professions, like even freelancers that you might consider in other professions, do away with the overhead of a bricks and mortar office, or at least a really, really expensive one, and focus on passing those savings along to their clients without impacting the actual margin that they absorb, like the money that they're making as a practicing professional. So I know that sounds like a lot, and there's always a lot to learn and be done, but I think those are a few of the areas that are both a challenge, but also a really significant opportunity that's getting accelerated by what's going on out there right now.
All right, last question for you, George. And because you put together metrics and all that other type of thing, so I'll ask you to make a prediction. So as COVID-19 goes away, or at least the impact of it goes away, what things do you think will be left with us permanently from the side of the legal profession?
That's a great question. And hey, look, no guarantees, but I'll place my bets too and make my predictions. I don't think that we're going to walk back from the accelerated tech adoption that we've seen. I don't think people are just going to go back from the convenience of Zoom and other methods of interaction, and also asynchronous stuff. So using web interfaces or apps to exchange information with each other, and go back to the inconvenience of meeting in person to do everything. What I do think we're going to do is meet in person for really, really high value interactions. Like when we need to make a connection with someone, or there's an important personal human milestone, we'll probably still crave that human connection, but we're not going to walk back from things like our 90-year-olds signing their retainer letters via iPad and the like. I think it just drives this convenience that we probably would have never tried the first time, but that I don't think we're going to walk all the way back from. And for law firms, that's going to have significant ramifications. Client expectations, the way that you position yourself out in the market, they're not going to go back to business as usual before. And, it's a challenge, like I said, but also an opportunity to go back to a better normal once we're through.
All right. Well, looks like we've reached the end of the road for today's episode, but I want to thank George for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you like what you heard, please rate and leave us a review in your favorite podcasting app. And we'll see you next time for another episode of On the Road with Legal Talk Network.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, or download our free Legal Talk Network app in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.